You're done here, Reese. Effective immediately. You're relieved of your duties pending discharge proceedings. Security clearance revoked. You'll be confined to quarters until transportation can be arranged to send you home. Captain Walsh's voice carried across the scorching courtyard as I stood at rigid attention, clutching a manila envelope that contained every piece of evidence I'd gathered. Around me, 80 soldiers watched my public humiliation. Some laughed, others whispered. A few looked away, embarrassed to witness my career ending in disgrace. "I'm sure they miss you back in Cape Town," Walsh continued, his smile cruel and satisfied. "Maybe you can find work there as a mall security guard?" The crowd erupted in laughter. I didn't flinch, didn't blink, just stood there, absorbing their mockery, their contempt, their absolute certainty that I was finished. What none of them knew, what Captain Walsh couldn't possibly have imagined, was that the email I'd sent 3 days earlier hadn't just disappeared into the bureaucratic void. It had landed on the desk of someone whose name made corrupt officers wake up in cold sweats. Someone who'd built his entire career hunting people exactly like Walsh. Someone who was, at that very moment, reviewing every single page of evidence I'd documented. In exactly 42 hours, Commander David Scott would arrive at this base. In 42 hours, everything would change. They thought I was the one being fired. They had no idea they were the ones being investigated. This is the story of how I got fired for being too honest, and how that firing became the beginning of something they never saw coming. But to understand what happened on that blazing desert courtyard, we need to go back 3 months. Back to when I first arrived at Forward Operating Base Sentinel with a single duffel bag, a quiet plan to disappear into obscurity, and absolutely no intention of becoming the most hated person on the base. Some plans don't work out the way you expect. The desert sun beat down on Forward Operating Base Sentinel with the kind of heat that made mirages dance on the tarmac. It was 1147 hours on a Tuesday in August, and the temperature had already climbed past 112 degrees Fahrenheit. The air shimmered with waves of heat that distorted the distant mountains, making them look like they were breathing. Staff Sergeant Rita Reese stood at rigid attention in the middle of the compound's main square, her uniform crisp despite the oppressive heat, sweat trickling down her spine beneath the camouflage fabric. In her hands, she clutched a manila envelope, the kind that changes lives. Around her, a semicircle of soldiers had gathered, some pretending to be busy with equipment checks, others openly watching what was clearly about to be a spectacle. Captain Walsh stood before her, his face red from more than just the sun. His tablet reflected harsh light into his eyes as he read from the screen, his voice carrying across the courtyard with practiced military projection. "Insubordination, disrespect to a superior officer, conduct unbecoming." He looked up, his lips curling into something between a smile and a sneer. "Staff Sergeant Reese, you seem to think the United States Army operates on your personal code of ethics rather than the chain of command." A few snickers erupted from the crowd. Corporal Jennings, Walsh's favorite lapdog, didn't even try to hide his grin. "Guess that South African honesty doesn't translate well, huh?" he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. More laughter. Rita's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but she didn't move, didn't blink. Her dark eyes remained fixed on a point just over Captain Walsh's shoulder, the way she'd been trained, the way she'd perfected over 8 years of service. But there was something else, something the jeering crowd didn't notice. On Rita's left wrist, barely visible beneath her sleeve, was a bracelet, not the standard issue kind. This one was woven from paracord in a specific pattern, black, crimson, and a single thread of gold running through the center. It caught the sunlight for just a moment as a bead of sweat rolled past it. Sergeant First Class Martinez, standing at the edge of the crowd, frowned. His eyes locked onto that bracelet, and something flickered across his face. Recognition? Confusion? He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, his expression troubled. "You're done here, Reese," Walsh continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Effective immediately. You're relieved of your duties pending discharge proceedings. Security clearance revoked. You'll be confined to quarters until transportation can be arranged to send you home." He paused for effect. "I'm sure they miss you back in Cape Town. Maybe you can find work there as a—" He pretended to think, "mall security guard?" The crowd erupted in laughter. Even some of Rita's own squad couldn't suppress their smirks. After all, she'd always been the one who asked too many questions, who pushed back when orders didn't make sense, who wouldn't just nod and say, "Yes, sir," like everyone else. She'd made life harder for all of them with her rigid moral compass and her inability to look the other way. Rita's fingers tightened slightly on the envelope. Inside was her response, a detailed email she'd sent through official channels 3 days ago, documenting every instance of the corruption she'd witnessed, the falsified supply reports, the equipment that mysteriously disappeared and reappeared on the black market, the patrol routes that had been deliberately altered, putting soldiers at risk for reasons no one would explain. She'd been honest, devastatingly, comprehensively honest. They thought she was just another troublemaker, another idealistic soldier who couldn't handle the gray areas of military reality. They thought sending her home would solve their problem, would silence her inconvenient questions and her paper trail of incident reports. They were wrong. What they didn't know, what Captain Walsh, Corporal Jennings, and the laughing crowd couldn't possibly understand, was that the email Rita had sent hadn't just gone to the base command. It hadn't stopped at the colonel's desk or even at division headquarters. That bracelet on her wrist, with its specific pattern of black, crimson, and gold, wasn't a fashion statement. It was a signal, a marker, a reminder of who she'd been before she'd requested this quiet posting at a forgettable desert base in the middle of nowhere. And in exactly 48 hours, someone was going to read that email, someone whose name made generals stand up straighter, someone who'd been looking for someone like Rita, someone too honest to be bought, too principled to be intimidated, too stubborn to quit. "Dismissed," Walsh barked, waving his hand dismissively. "Get out of my sight." Rita executed a perfect about-face, her boots crunching on the sandy concrete. As she walked away, her head held high despite the jeers and whispered comments following her, Sergeant First Class Martinez watched her go. His hand unconsciously moved to his own collar, where a similar pattern was tattooed just beneath his uniform, small enough to hide, significant enough to remember. He pulled out his phone, hesitated, then typed a quick message to a number he hadn't contacted in 3 years. "Sir, we might have a problem, or a solution. There's someone here you need to know about." The Arizona sun continued its merciless assault on the base, but inside the command center's climate-controlled briefing room, the temperature was about to get much, much colder. Because in exactly 42 hours, Commander David Scott, recipient of 2 Silver Stars, a Purple Heart, and a reputation for cleaning house wherever he was assigned, would arrive at FOB Sentinel for what Walsh's superiors had described as a routine inspection. But there was nothing routine about David Scott, and there was nothing ordinary about Rita Reese. The desert might have been quiet, but a storm was coming. If you've ever been punished for doing the right thing, you know how this feels. If you've ever watched someone get silenced for speaking truth, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will restore your faith in justice and make you question everything you thought you knew about courage. Drop a comment. Have you ever been fired or punished for being too honest? Let's hear your story. And tell me where you're watching from. 3 months earlier, Rita Reese had arrived at Forward Operating Base Sentinel with a single duffel bag, a service record that read like a bureaucrat's dream, solid, unremarkable, competent, and absolutely no desire to be noticed. She was 29 years old, though the fine lines around her eyes made her look older in the harsh desert light. Born in Johannesburg, raised in Cape Town, she joined the South African National Defense Force at 18 before transferring to the U.S. Army through a special skills program at 22. Her file listed her specialties as logistics coordination and supply chain management, the kind of unglamorous work that kept armies running but never made headlines. Perfect. Her quarters were exactly what she'd expected: a converted shipping container with a narrow bed, a metal locker, a desk that wobbled on uneven legs, and a small window that looked out onto the motor pool. The air conditioning unit wheezed like an asthmatic trying to run a marathon, but it worked. That was all that mattered. Rita had unpacked with military efficiency. Uniforms hung precisely 2 inches apart. Boots lined up beneath the bed, toes pointed out. Toiletries arranged by height on the single shelf above the sink. The only item that broke the pattern of militant organization was a photograph tucked into the frame of the small mirror. A picture of Table Mountain at sunset, the cables of the aerial cableway visible against the purple sky. Home. Or what used to be home. Her first week had been an exercise in invisibility. She'd learned the mess hall schedule and always arrived during the quietest times. She'd memorized the duty roster and positioned herself where she'd be useful, but not prominent. When Sergeant Kim had accidentally ordered 300 gallons of diesel instead of 30, Rita had quietly caught the error and corrected it before anyone noticed. When Private Torres couldn't figure out why the supply requisition system kept rejecting his forms, Rita had spent her lunch break walking him through the process, then disappeared before he could properly thank her. She was good at her job, exceptionally good, the kind of good that makes things run smoothly without anyone quite realizing who's making it happen. "Reese, you're like a ghost," Specialist Hammond had commented one evening as they'd passed each other near the communications tent. "You just materialize when stuff needs fixing, then poof, gone." Rita had smiled politely. "Just doing my job, Hammond." "Yeah, but most people do their job and make sure everyone knows about it. You're like, I don't know, a logistics ninja or something." If Hammond had known how close to the truth he was, he might not have been so casual about it. Because while Rita appeared unremarkable to everyone at FOB Sentinel, there were small signs, tiny inconsistencies that didn't quite fit the image of a quiet supply sergeant content to fade into the background. Her morning routine, for instance. Every day at 0500 hours, before the base fully woke, Rita ran. Not the casual jogging that some soldiers did to stay in shape. She ran like someone training for something specific. 6 miles at a pace that would have impressed the base's top physical training instructors, followed by a calisthenics routine that included exercises most soldiers couldn't name, let alone perform. Lieutenant Pack had noticed once, arriving early for a surprise inspection of the motor pool. He'd watched Rita complete a series of movements, flowing, controlled, precise, that looked more like combat training than morning exercise. When she'd finished and turned to find him watching, she'd simply nodded a greeting and walked away, offering no explanation. Pack had meant to ask her about it. He'd forgotten by lunch. Then there was her desk in the supply office. To a casual observer, it was unremarkable. Computer monitor, keyboard, stack of requisition forms, coffee mug from a tourist shop in Durban. But anyone who looked closely, and no one did, would notice that the photographs weren't quite right. The coffee mug was positioned exactly 3.2 inches from the edge of the desk, never varying. Her pens were arranged by color in a specific sequence that had nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with a coding system. And that bracelet on her wrist, the one with black, crimson, and gold paracord, was always visible when she typed, as if she wanted it to be seen by someone who knew what to look for. Rita's competence manifested in quiet ways. When Captain Walsh had complained about supply shortages 3 weeks into her deployment, Rita had solved the problem by identifying redundancies in the requisition system that no one else had noticed. When the mess hall had run dangerously low on water purification tablets due to a shipping delay, Rita had located an emergency cache in a forgotten storage unit and had it redistributed before anyone got sick. "How did you even know that was there?" Sergeant Davies had asked, genuinely curious. Rita had shrugged. "I read the inventory logs from the past 5 years. It was listed in the 2019 audit." "You read 5 years of inventory logs? For fun?" "I'm thorough." Davies had laughed and called her a nerd. Rita had smiled and said nothing. She didn't mention that she'd actually read 12 years of logs, cross-referenced them with satellite imagery of the base expansion, and identified 7 other forgotten caches that she was keeping in reserve for emergencies no one else was planning for. To her fellow soldiers, Rita was reliable but boring, competent but unremarkable. The kind of person you'd want on your team but wouldn't think to invite for drinks. She never told stories about her past deployments, never bragged about her qualifications, never pushed herself forward when opportunities for advancement appeared. She was the woman who made sure everyone else's gear arrived on time, who could solve logistical puzzles in her sleep, who kept the machine running without ever demanding recognition. What they saw was a competent supply sergeant content with her small corner of the military world. What they didn't see was the woman who woke at 0300 hours sometimes, drenched in sweat from dreams she never discussed. The woman who could field strip and reassemble 17 different weapon systems despite being a logistics specialist. The woman who spoke 4 languages fluently and could read 3 more. The woman whose eyes automatically cataloged exits, sightlines, and potential threats in every room she entered. The contrast was stark to anyone who knew what to look for. But no one at FOB Sentinel was looking. They saw Rita Reese, paper pusher extraordinaire, and they looked right past everything else, all except Sergeant First Class Martinez. Martinez was 42, a career soldier with deployment stretching back to the early 2000s. He ran the motor pool with the kind of gruff efficiency that made new recruits nervous and veterans respectful. He didn't talk much about his own past, but rumor had it he'd done time with some specialized units before requesting a quieter posting to finish out his career. He'd noticed Rita on her second day, not because she'd done anything remarkable, but because she'd done something that didn't quite fit. She'd been helping unload a supply truck when one of the boxes had broken open, spilling machine parts across the ground. Most people would have cursed and started picking them up randomly. Rita had crouched down, surveyed the scattered components for exactly 3 seconds, then began retrieving them in a specific order, not by size or convenience, but by assembly sequence. Martinez had rebuilt enough engines to recognize that kind of knowledge. That wasn't something you learned from reading supply manuals. That was hands-on, tactical knowledge, the kind special operations mechanics had. He'd started watching her after that, casually, just to satisfy his curiosity. The morning runs that were too fast and too precise, the way she carried herself, not with the slouch of someone trying to avoid attention, but with the controlled neutrality of someone trained to blend in. The bracelet that matched a pattern he'd seen exactly once before on the wrist of an operator he'd worked with in Kandahar, an operator who'd been part of something that didn't officially exist. Martinez hadn't said anything, wasn't his business, but he'd noted it, filed it away, kept watching. When Rita had started asking questions about supply discrepancies 2 months into her deployment, Martinez had been one of the few people who'd listened. Not because he cared particularly about missing equipment, shrinkage was always a problem, but because Rita asked the right questions, specific questions, questions that suggested she was building a case, not just complaining. "Reese," he'd said to her one evening as she'd been leaving the supply office, "you might want to be careful who you ask about those missing generators." She'd looked at him with those dark, steady eyes. "Why's that, Sergeant?" "Because some questions have answers people don't want found." "Then maybe they shouldn't create questions in the first place." Martinez had smiled despite himself. "You got a lot of principles for a supply sergeant. My mother taught me that principles are portable. They travel with you no matter where you go." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was. Rita had adjusted her bracelet unconsciously. "She also taught me that silence in the face of wrong is the same as approval." Martinez had nodded slowly. "That bracelet, where'd you get it?" "A friend made it for me, long time ago." "Must have been a good friend. That pattern means something specific to certain people." Rita had met his eyes directly then, and for just a moment, the unremarkable supply sergeant mask had slipped. What Martinez saw beneath it made him straighten unconsciously. A glimpse of someone who'd seen things, done things, survived things that most soldiers only heard about in rumors. "Yes," she'd said simply. "It does." Then the mask had returned, and she'd walked away, leaving Martinez standing there wondering exactly who Rita Reese really was and why someone like her was wasting away at a nowhere base in the middle of the desert. He'd gotten his answer 3 weeks later when Rita had sent her email, the one that would cost her everything, or so it seemed. The trouble started small, the way trouble always does. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Rita's conversation with Martinez, when she'd noticed the first major discrepancy. 12 crates of medical supplies, antibiotics, surgical equipment, trauma kits, had been signed for and received according to the digital logs. But when Rita had physically checked the medical storage facility, only 8 crates were present. She'd double-checked, triple-checked. Run the inventory twice more just to be certain. 4 crates, valued at approximately $48,000, had simply vanished. Rita had done what any competent supply sergeant would do. She'd filed a report. Standard Form 361, loss statement. Clean, professional, by the book. She'd submitted it through proper channels to Captain Walsh, her immediate superior. Walsh had called her into his office that same afternoon. "Reese." He hadn't looked up from his computer. "This loss statement you filed." "Yes, sir. 4 crates of medical supplies are unaccounted for. The paperwork shows—" "I'm aware of what the paperwork shows." Walsh had finally looked at her, his expression somewhere between annoyed and amused. "I'm also aware that supply chain errors happen all the time. Paperwork gets filed incorrectly. Crates get marked as delivered to us when they actually went to FOB Phoenix. Happens constantly." "Sir, I've contacted FOB Phoenix. They have no record." "Then it went somewhere else. The point, Sergeant, is that you're creating unnecessary paperwork over what's probably just an administrative error." He'd leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You're new here. You don't understand how things work yet. We don't raise red flags every time there's a small discrepancy. It makes us look incompetent. It makes me look incompetent. Do you understand?" Rita had stood at attention, her expression neutral. "Sir, $48,000 in medical supplies isn't a small discrepancy. It is when you consider our annual supply budget runs into the tens of millions." Walsh had smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Here's what you're going to do, Sergeant. You're going to withdraw that loss statement. You're going to mark those 4 crates as in transit delivery delayed, and you're going to stop wasting everyone's time with this by-the-book nonsense. Are we clear?" Every instinct Rita had was screaming. The practiced calm she'd maintained for months was being tested. She'd known this moment would come eventually, the moment when doing the right thing would conflict with following orders. "Sir, with respect, I can't falsify official records. If the supplies are in transit, we need proof of that. If they're lost, we need to document it properly, so—" "Sergeant Reese," Walsh's voice had dropped to a dangerous quiet. "I'm not asking you. I'm telling you. This is a direct order. Withdraw the report. Mark the supplies as delayed." End of discussion. Rita had felt the weight of that bracelet on her wrist. Black, crimson, gold. A reminder of promises made and principles worth keeping. "I can't do that, sir." The silence that followed had been arctic. "Get out of my office," Walsh had finally said, his face flushing red. "And Sergeant, you've just made a very stupid career decision." By that evening, the entire base knew about it. Military gossip traveled faster than radio waves. Rita had been in the mess hall, eating dinner alone at her usual corner table, when Corporal Jennings and 3 of his friends had sat down at the table next to hers, close enough that their conversation was clearly meant to be overheard. "Did you hear about Reese?" Jennings had said, his voice carrying. "Apparently, she thinks she's going to single-handedly reform the entire U.S. military supply system." Laughter from his companions. "What happened?" Private Miller had asked, playing along. "She filed some big dramatic report about missing supplies. Captain Walsh told her to drop it, like any reasonable person would, and she refused. Said she couldn't falsify records." Jennings had mimicked Rita's accent mockingly, as if the rest of us are all criminals or something. "Thinks she's better than everyone else," Specialist Chen had added. "Too good to understand how things actually work in the real world. I give her 2 months before she requests a transfer," Miller had predicted. "Girls like that, they come in thinking they're going to change everything. Then reality hits, and they realize nobody wants their drama." Rita had continued eating, her expression unchanged, her movements precise and controlled. She'd cut her chicken into exact portions, taken measured bites, given no indication she'd heard a word, but she'd heard, and they'd known she'd heard. That was the point. The second incident had come 5 days later, during a supply brief that Rita had to present to the company commanders. She'd prepared meticulously as always. Charts showing usage patterns, recommendations for better inventory management, projections for the next quarter. Professional, clean, helpful. Captain Walsh had attended, along with Captain Rodriguez from Alpha Company and Captain Okafor from Bravo Company. About 30 soldiers had filled the briefing room, many of them standing along the walls. Rita had made it exactly 12 minutes into her presentation when Walsh had interrupted. "Sergeant Reese, can you explain to everyone here why our medical supply numbers don't match what you're showing on this chart?" Rita had paused, her laser pointer steady on the projection screen. "Sir, these numbers reflect the physical inventory as of yesterday's count. If there's a discrepancy with the digital records, that's actually one of the systemic issues I'm addressing in the next section." No. Walsh had stood up, walking to the front of the room. "I think what you mean is these numbers reflect your count, which, as we've established, tends to be, let's say, overly dramatic." Scattered chuckles from the audience. "Sir, I've verified these numbers 3 times. I can show you." "What you can show me," Walsh had said, taking the laser pointer from her hand, "is that you still haven't learned the difference between theoretical accuracy and practical reality. This isn't university, Sergeant. This isn't some academic exercise where you get points for showing your work. This is the real military, where we deal with real constraints and real complications." He'd turned to address the room, leaving Rita standing awkwardly to the side. "How many of you have had to deal with supply systems that don't quite sync up?" Walsh had asked. "Systems where the paperwork says one thing but the reality is slightly different." Hands had gone up throughout the room. Heads had nodded. Of course they had. Every soldier who'd ever dealt with military bureaucracy knew that systems were imperfect. "Exactly," Walsh had continued, "because we're human beings operating in imperfect conditions with imperfect systems. We do the best we can. We don't create panic over minor discrepancies. We don't waste everyone's time with reports about problems that will solve themselves." He'd glanced back at Rita. Some people understand that. Others need more seasoning. The laughter had been louder that time, more confident. Rita had stood there, her posture perfect, her face impassive, while 30 soldiers learned that questioning Captain Walsh's methods was something to be mocked, not respected. "Thank you, Sergeant Reese," Walsh had said, dismissing her with a wave. "Captain Rodriguez, you had some updates on vehicle maintenance?" Rita had gathered her materials, slowly, methodically, refusing to rush, and walked out of the briefing room with her head high. Behind her, she'd heard the whispers start immediately. So awkward. She really doesn't know when to quit. Somebody needs to tell her this isn't how you get promoted. Sergeant First Class Martinez had been standing in the hallway outside. He'd caught her eye as she'd passed, given her the smallest nod. Not agreement, not approval, just acknowledgement. "You're not crazy. I see what you see." It had been the only thing that kept Rita from punching a wall. The third incident had been the worst. It had happened in front of the entire motor pool during a Saturday morning vehicle inspection. Required attendance, all enlisted personnel not on duty, approximately 80 soldiers, gathered in the blazing sun while various NCOs checked that vehicles were properly maintained and ready for deployment. Rita had been assigned to verify that emergency supply kits were present in each vehicle. Simple task, straightforward, difficult to screw up. Except that in the third Humvee she'd checked, the emergency medical kit had been nearly empty. No tourniquets, no combat gauze, no chest seals. Just some basic bandages and a half-empty bottle of saline solution. She'd flagged it immediately, calling over Sergeant Davies, who was supervising her section. "This kit isn't up to standard," she'd reported. "It's missing critical supplies." Davies had glanced at it, frowned. "Yeah, that's not right. We'll need to— Is there a problem here?" Captain Walsh had materialized like a shark scenting blood. He'd been inspecting vehicles 3 rows over, but somehow he'd sensed an opportunity. "Sir, This medical kit is significantly under-equipped, Rita had explained. If this vehicle were deployed and encountered casualties, the crew wouldn't have the supplies needed for— Let me see that. Walsh had taken the kit from her hands, made a show of examining it. Sergeant Reese, this kit has bandages, saline, pain medication. It's got the basics. Sir, Army regulations specify that vehicle emergency kits must include— I know what the regulations specify. Walsh had looked around at the growing crowd of soldiers who'd stopped their own inspections to watch. Here's a question for everyone. How many of you have deployed with equipment that was less than 100% perfect according to regulations? Hands had gone up. Lots of them. Right, because that's reality. We work with what we have. We adapt. We don't shut down operations because something is 90% instead of 100%. He tossed the medical kit back to Rita. She'd caught it reflexively. Sergeant Reese seems to think that if every item isn't perfectly in place, we should ground all vehicles and file emergency reports. Can you imagine if we actually operated that way? We'd never leave the base. Laughter. More of it now. Rita had felt the mood of the crowd shift, the way crowds always do when they sense someone being publicly disciplined. It was entertainment, a break from the monotony. Sir, with respect, this isn't about perfection. This is about basic life-saving— What this is about, Walsh had interrupted, his voice rising, is you not understanding your role here. You're a supply sergeant, Reese. Your job is to count things and order things. Your job is not to be the base safety inspector. Your job is not to create problems where none exist. Your job is certainly not to stand here and lecture me about regulations in front of my soldiers. The crowd had gone quiet then. The laughter had died. This had crossed from mockery into something else, a public dressing down, career-damaging, humiliating. Rita had stood there, the inadequate medical kit still in her hands, and made a choice. You're right, sir, she'd said quietly. My job is to count things. She'd set the medical kit carefully on the hood of the Humvee. So let me count this. 0 tourniquets when regulations require 4. 0 chest seals when regulations require 2. 0 combat gauze when regulations require 6 packages. 0 nasopharyngeal airways. 0 occlusive dressings. 0 of the supplies that could mean the difference between a soldier bleeding out in the desert or making it to a field hospital. She'd looked Walsh directly in the eyes. I can count just fine, sir. The question is whether anyone is listening to what the numbers mean. The silence that followed had been absolute. Walsh's face had turned a shade of red that suggested either rage or a pending cardiac event. His jaw had worked soundlessly for a moment, processing the fact that she'd just contradicted him again in front of 80 witnesses. You're done here, he'd finally managed. Report to my office in 1 hour. And Sergeant, start thinking about how you're going to explain your attitude problem to your next commanding officer, because you won't be working for me much longer. He'd stalked off, leaving Rita standing alone beside the Humvee, an island of isolation in a sea of soldiers who were all suddenly very interested in their own vehicle inspections. As the crowd had dispersed, Rita had heard the whispers, harsher now, less amused and more condemning. She's got a death wish. Way to throw away your career over nothing. Somebody should have warned her this isn't how you survive in the military. Only 2 people had approached her after that. The first was Private Torres, the young soldier she'd helped with requisition forms her first week. He'd looked nervous but determined. Sergeant Reese, I just want you to know, you were right about the medical kit. My brother deployed with inadequate supplies in Afghanistan. He didn't make it. Torres had swallowed hard. So, thanks for saying something. He'd walked away quickly, before anyone could see him talking to her. The second person had been Martinez. He'd waited until almost everyone else had left, then approached with his characteristic bluntness. You know you just ended your career here, right? I know. And you did it anyway. I did it anyway. Martinez had studied her for a long moment. That bracelet. Who gave it to you? Rita had touched it unconsciously. Someone who taught me that some things are more important than career advancement. Must have been one hell of a teacher. The best. Martinez had nodded slowly. You're going to need allies soon, Reese. Walsh isn't going to just fire you. He's going to try to destroy you. Make sure nobody ever takes you seriously again. I know. So what's your play? Rita had looked at him then. Really looked at him, making a calculation about trust and timing and risk. I'm going to tell the truth, she'd said simply. All of it. In writing. Through official channels. I'm going to document every discrepancy, every missing item, every regulation violation. I'm going to create a paper trail that can't be ignored or buried or explained away. That's suicide. Maybe. Or maybe it's the only way to force people to pay attention. Martinez had smiled grimly. You really are one of them, aren't you? The stubborn ones who'd rather die on their feet than live on their knees. I don't plan on dying, Sergeant. None of us do. But sometimes plans change. He'd walked away then, leaving Rita alone in the motor pool with her principles, her bruised ego, and a growing sense that she'd just lit a fuse on something that couldn't be unlit. That night, in her converted shipping container quarters, Rita had opened her laptop and begun typing. Not just about the medical supplies or the empty vehicle kits. Everything. 3 months of careful observation, meticulous documentation, quiet investigation, supply discrepancies, equipment disappearing from manifests, patrol routes being altered without explanation, maintenance records that didn't match physical inspections. A pattern, clear as day to anyone willing to look. She'd typed for 4 hours straight, her fingers flying across the keyboard, building a case that was precise, damning, and impossible to dismiss as the complaints of a disgruntled employee. She'd cited regulations, cross-referenced documents, included photographs with metadata timestamps. At 02:37 hours, she'd hit send. The email had gone to Captain Walsh, as required by chain of command. But Rita had learned a few things in her years of service. She'd learned about CC fields and BCC fields. She'd learned about official channels and unofficial ones, so the email had also gone to the base commander, Colonel Marsh, to the Inspector General's office, to the Judge Advocate General's office, and to one more recipient, an email address that most people wouldn't recognize, but that certain people who wore bracelets with black, crimson, and gold, would know was connected to someone who made problems like this their personal mission. Someone named Commander David Scott. Rita had closed her laptop, laid back on her narrow bed, and stared at the ceiling of her container quarters. She'd known that everything was about to change, knew that Walsh would come after her hard. Knew that she'd become a pariah, an example, a cautionary tale about what happens when you don't play along. But she'd also known something else. Something that made her lips curve into the smallest smile in the darkness. She'd known that her email wasn't going to be buried or ignored. She'd known that in approximately 48 hours, someone was going to read it who actually cared about things like integrity and accountability and the lives of soldiers who depended on equipment that was supposed to be there. She'd touched her bracelet one more time, feeling the specific pattern of the paracord. Watch over me, she'd whispered in Afrikaans, the language of her childhood, just a little longer. Outside, the desert night was cold and clear, stars scattered across the sky like thrown diamonds. Inside, Rita Reese had made herself the most hated person on Forward Operating Base Sentinel, and she'd done it on purpose. The 48 hours following Rita's email were the longest of her deployment. She'd been officially relieved of her supply duties and confined to quarters pending administrative review, military speak for, "We're building a case to destroy you." Captain Walsh had made sure everyone knew she was being investigated for insubordination, creating a hostile work environment, and willful disregard of orders. The base rumor mill had added its own embellishments. She was mentally unstable, she had a grudge against authority, she'd made false accusations before at other postings. None of it was true. All of it was believed. Rita spent most of those hours in her container quarters, reading, exercising in the small space, and waiting. She wasn't allowed in the mess hall during peak hours, wasn't permitted near the supply depot, and had been strongly encouraged to avoid common areas where her presence might create tension. It was isolation disguised as administrative procedure, but isolation gave Rita time to think. And thinking led her to notice things she might have otherwise missed. On the morning of her second day of confinement, Rita had been doing pull-ups from the exposed pipe that ran across her ceiling, her 43rd rep, when she'd heard voices outside her container. She'd dropped down silently, moving to the small window that looked out onto the access road between the residential containers. Corporal Jennings and Specialist Chen were walking past, their voices low but audible through the thin metal walls. "Can't believe Walsh is actually going through with it," Chen was saying. "Why wouldn't he? She's been a pain since day one. Better to cut her loose now before she causes real problems." "Yeah, but what if she's right? About the supplies, I mean." Jennings had laughed. "Right about what? That sometimes paperwork doesn't match inventory? That's every military base ever. She's making a mountain out of a molehill because she's got some kind of savior complex. I guess. It's just, Martinez seems to think there's more to it. Martinez is getting soft in his old age, probably feeling protective because she's..." Their voices had faded as they'd moved out of earshot, but Rita had stood at her window for several minutes afterward, processing that snippet of conversation. Martinez seems to think there's more to it. So Martinez was talking. Not openly defending her, that would be career suicide, but planting seeds of doubt, making people question the official narrative. Rita had smiled slightly. She'd been right to trust him. She'd returned to her pull-ups, but her mind had been elsewhere. Martinez had seen her bracelet, had recognized it. That meant he'd worked with people who wore similar markers, people from the programs that didn't officially exist, people who operated in the shadows and left no trace except small symbols that only the initiated understood. The bracelet on her wrist was more than decoration. It was a credential, a badge of honor from a community that valued capability over rank, results over politics, and truth over convenience. Rita had earned hers 6 years ago in a place she wasn't allowed to talk about, doing things she wasn't allowed to acknowledge. The operation had been classified at a level that required 3 separate security clearances just to know it existed. She'd been attached to a joint task force, South African and American special operations, working together on a counterterrorism initiative in Mozambique. The details were still classified, but the outcome had been successful enough that Commander David Scott, then a lieutenant commander leading the American contingent, had personally woven the bracelet and given it to her on the last day of the operation. "Wear this," he'd said, "and people who matter will know you're someone who matters." Black for the darkness they'd operated in, crimson for the blood they'd prevented from being spilled, gold for the integrity that guided every decision. Rita touched the bracelet now, feeling the familiar texture of the paracord. She'd worn it every day since, hidden under her sleeve, a reminder of who she'd been before she'd requested a quiet posting and tried to disappear into the anonymity of supply logistics. But you couldn't really disappear. Not when you'd been trained to see patterns, to notice discrepancies, to ask questions that others didn't think to ask. She'd seen corruption before. Small-scale stuff, mostly. Equipment theft, minor fraud, lazy officers cutting corners. But what she'd discovered at FOB Sentinel was different. Larger, more systematic. The missing supplies weren't random losses or administrative errors. They were deliberate, organized, and profitable for someone. Rita had spent 3 months documenting it all, and now she'd put it in writing and sent it to people who couldn't ignore it. All she had to do was survive until they arrived. Late that afternoon, Rita had been lying on her bed, reading a dog-eared copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, when there'd been a knock on her door. 3 sharp raps, official. She'd opened it to find Private Torres standing there, looking nervous and slightly guilty. "Sergeant Reese, ma'am. Sergeant, sorry." Torres had glanced around as if checking for witnesses. "I'm not supposed to be here." "Then why are you here, Torres?" I was doing inventory in the supply depot, helping Sergeant Davies because they're short-handed now that you're..." He'd trailed off awkwardly. "Anyway, I found something. In your old desk." He'd pulled a small object from his pocket and pressed it into Rita's hand, then left quickly without another word. Rita had closed the door and examined what Torres had given her, a USB drive. Standard military issue, the kind used for transferring inventory data, but wrapped around it was a piece of paper with a handwritten note in Martinez's distinctive scrawl. Found this in the back of your desk drawer. Thought you might want it before they clear out your workspace. M. Rita had turned the USB drive over in her hands. She hadn't left a USB drive in her desk, which meant Martinez had put it there for Torres to find and return to her. But why? She'd booted up her personal laptop, the one that wasn't connected to any military network, and plugged in the drive. It contained a single folder labeled Maintenance Records 2023 to 2024. Inside were dozens of files, vehicle maintenance logs, equipment service histories, repair invoices, all perfectly mundane and ordinary. The kind of data that any motor pool would generate and that Martinez, as motor pool supervisor, would have access to. Rita had started reading. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Standard maintenance procedures, routine repairs, regular service intervals. Then she'd noticed the pattern. Every third month, like clockwork, there were maintenance records for vehicles that had supposedly been serviced at FOB Sentinel's motor pool, but the invoices were for parts that didn't match the vehicles listed. Brake pads for vehicles that had just had their brakes replaced the previous month. Engine filters for vehicles that were still under warranty and would have had such repairs done by contractors. Transmission fluid for vehicles that used a different type of transmission entirely. Someone was generating fake maintenance records to justify purchasing parts that were never actually installed, parts that were probably being sold on the black market or diverted to non-military use. Rita had cross-referenced the dates with her own supply records, the ones she'd meticulously maintained over the past 3 months. The parts orders coincided exactly with the dates when her supply manifests showed discrepancies. Medical supplies going missing? Same day as a large maintenance order. Equipment vanishing from inventory? Same day as an emergency repair that required ordering expensive components. It was a scheme, elegant in its simplicity. Use legitimate maintenance needs as cover to order excessive supplies, then divert the excess for profit. The motor pool records would justify the orders. The supply chain complexity would hide the theft, and if anyone asked questions, you could always blame administrative errors or shipping delays. Rita had sat back, feeling the pieces click into place. Martinez had given her the evidence, not just information, proof, hard data that showed the pattern, that connected the dots, that turned her observations into a prosecutable case. But why? Martinez was career military, invested in the system. He had a pension to protect, a reputation to maintain. Why risk it all to help someone who'd already been labeled a troublemaker? Rita had thought back to their conversations, to the way he'd looked at her bracelet, to his comment about the stubborn ones who'd rather die on their feet than live on their knees. Martinez had been one of them too, maybe still was, in his way. He'd seen things that had changed him, had probably made the same kinds of difficult choices Rita was making now, and he'd recognized in her someone worth helping, even if it cost him. Rita had copied all the files to her laptop, then deleted them from the USB drive and reformatted it. If anyone checked, it would appear blank, recently wiped. She'd hidden her laptop under a loose floor panel beneath her bed, a hiding spot she'd identified her first week because old habits from old operations died hard. Then she'd waited. The next morning, Rita had been summoned to an informal meeting with Captain Walsh and a Lieutenant Briggs from the Judge Advocate General's office. They'd met in a small conference room, all harsh fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable chairs. Lieutenant Briggs had been young, probably on his first real posting, eager to please. Walsh had clearly briefed him on the troubled sergeant he'd be dealing with. "Sergeant Reese," Briggs had begun, opening a folder with her service record, "I've been asked to review your recent conduct and determine if formal charges are warranted. Do you understand why you're here?" "Yes, sir." Captain Walsh has detailed several incidents of insubordination, refusal to follow direct orders, and behavior that he characterizes as disruptive to unit cohesion. He's also shown me the email you sent to multiple recipients without proper authorization through chain of command. That alone constitutes— With respect, sir, Rita had interrupted calmly. I sent that email exactly through proper chain of command. Captain Walsh was the primary recipient. The other recipients were copied per regulation, AR 20-1, which permits soldiers to report suspected fraud, waste, and abuse to appropriate authorities, including the Inspector General. Briggs had blinked, clearly not expecting her to cite specific regulations. Yes, well, the manner was professional and documented. Every claim I made was supported by evidence. If you'd like, I can provide you with— What I'd like— Walsh had cut in, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, is for you to stop playing lawyer and take responsibility for your behavior. You've been nothing but a problem since you arrived here. You question orders, you undermine authority, you create drama where none exists. And now you're trying to drag down good officers with baseless accusations because you can't handle military discipline. Rita had met his eyes steadily. Sir, are you saying the supply discrepancies I documented don't exist? I'm saying they're normal operational variations that you've deliberately mischaracterized to make it seem like— Are you saying the medical supplies that are listed as received but aren't physically present are normal? Sergeant Reese, are you saying the vehicle maintenance records that show parts being ordered for vehicles that don't require those parts are normal? The room had gone very quiet. Briggs had looked between them, confusion evident on his young face. Wait, there are discrepancies in maintenance records too? Walsh's face had gone carefully blank. I have no idea what she's talking about. I'm talking about systematic fraud, sir, Rita had said, her voice level and professional. I'm talking about a coordinated effort to steal military supplies and equipment. I'm talking about falsified records and misappropriated funds. And I'm talking about the fact that when I attempted to report this through proper channels, I was told to cover it up. That is a lie, Walsh had said, standing abruptly. Lieutenant Briggs, this soldier is clearly unstable. Her accusations are wild, unsupported, and frankly delusional. I recommend immediate psychiatric evaluation and discharge proceedings on the basis of— Then you won't mind if the Inspector General investigates my claims, Rita had said. Since they're baseless, an investigation will clear your name completely, unless, of course, there's something to find. Walsh had looked at her with pure hatred then. You just ended your career, Reese. You understand that? Even if you're somehow right about some minor irregularities, no one is ever going to want to work with you after this. You'll be toxic, untouchable. You'll spend the rest of your short military career filing paperwork in the basement of some nowhere recruiting office until you give up and quit. Rita had touched her bracelet, feeling the paracord pattern beneath her fingertips. That's assuming I have a short military career, sir. What's that supposed to mean? It means— a new voice had said from the doorway, that Sergeant Reese's career is about to get very interesting. Everyone had turned. Standing in the doorway was a man Rita had never seen before. Tall, early 50s, weathered face, gray shot hair cut military short. He'd been wearing a standard Army uniform. But something about the way he carried himself suggested that rank insignia didn't fully capture who he was. Behind him had stood Sergeant First Class Martinez, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes showing the faintest hint of satisfaction. "Who the hell are you?" Walsh had demanded. The man had smiled. It hadn't been a friendly smile. "Commander David Scott," he'd said, "and we need to talk." The temperature in the small conference room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Commander David Scott stepped fully into the room, and Rita felt something shift in her chest. Recognition, mixed with relief, mixed with a complex emotion she couldn't quite name. She hadn't seen him in 6 years, not since Mozambique, not since he'd tied that bracelet around her wrist with his own hands and told her she was one of the best operators he'd ever worked with. He looked older now, more lines around his eyes, gray threading through his hair where it had once been solid dark brown. But those eyes, sharp, assessing, missing nothing, were exactly as she remembered. Walsh had recovered from his initial surprise, his expression shifting to carefully controlled politeness. "Commander Scott, I wasn't aware we were expecting anyone from—" He'd paused, clearly not sure what Scott's presence represented. "From wherever you're from." "That's generally how I prefer it," Scott had said mildly. He'd set a tablet down on the conference table. "Lieutenant Briggs, you're dismissed. This conversation is now classified." Briggs had looked uncertain. "Sir, I'm with JAG." "I'm supposed to be reviewing, and you were reviewing allegations of insubordination. That review is concluded. What we're about to discuss falls under a different authority structure." Scott's tone hadn't been harsh, but it had carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You're dismissed, Lieutenant." Briggs had gathered his files and left quickly, clearly relieved to be away from whatever was about to happen. Scott had waited until the door closed, then turned to Martinez. "Sergeant Martinez, I appreciate your message. You were right to contact me." "Yes, sir." "You can go." Martinez had nodded, but before leaving, he'd caught Rita's eye. The look he'd given her had been brief but clear. "You're going to be okay." Then he'd left, closing the door behind him. Now it was just the three of them, Rita, Walsh, and Commander David Scott. Scott had remained standing, his posture relaxed, but his presence somehow filling the room. "Captain Walsh, I've spent the last 36 hours reviewing Sergeant Reese's report in detail. I've also spent that time pulling additional records from FOB Sentinel's supply chain, maintenance logs, and financial transactions for the past 18 months. Walsh's jaw had tightened. "With respect, Commander, I don't know what authority you think you have to—" "I have whatever authority I decide I have," Scott had interrupted, his voice still mild but carrying an edge that made Walsh stop talking. "I report directly to the Secretary of Defense on matters of military fraud and corruption. When I request records, they get delivered. When I ask questions, they get answered. And when I find evidence of systematic theft of military supplies during a time of war, people go to prison. Are we clear so far?" Walsh had said nothing, but his face had gone pale. Scott had picked up his tablet, scrolling through something. "Let's start with something simple. 4 crates of medical supplies, valued at $48,000, marked as received on June 15th, but never actually arriving at this base. Sergeant Reese reported this discrepancy. You ordered her to falsify records to hide it. Would you like to explain why?" "That's not— she's mischaracterizing— I have the email chain," Scott had said, turning his tablet to show Walsh the screen. "Your exact words were, 'You're going to mark those 4 crates as in transit. Delivery delayed.' That's an order to falsify official records. That alone is a court-martial offense." Walsh had swallowed hard. It was a judgment call. The supplies were probably just delayed in shipping. I didn't want to create unnecessary panic over— "The supplies weren't delayed," Scott had said. "They were diverted to a private medical supply company in Phoenix, Arizona. That company is owned by your brother-in-law. The supplies were then sold to civilian hospitals at a significant markup. Your family has netted approximately $230,000 from this scheme over the past year and a half." The silence that followed was deafening. Rita had kept her expression neutral, but internally she'd been reeling. She'd known there was theft. She hadn't known the scope. She hadn't known it went directly to Walsh's family. Walsh had opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I don't know what you think you've found, but I think I found a criminal enterprise," Scott had said flatly, "and I think you've been using your position to facilitate it. Medical supplies, vehicle parts, equipment, fuel, all of it siphoned off, falsely documented, and sold for personal profit. We're talking about potentially millions of dollars over 18 months. You can't prove— I can prove all of it." Scott had set the tablet down with a soft thud. "Bank records, shipping manifests, invoices with your brother-in-law's signature, email correspondence between you and several supply contractors. I have enough evidence to put you away for 15 to 20 years, maybe more if we can prove that any of the equipment you stole ended up in enemy hands." Walsh had sagged in his chair, the fight draining out of him visibly. Scott had let the silence stretch, then turned to Rita. Sergeant Reese, I need you to answer some questions, and I need you to answer them honestly, regardless of how it might make you look. Understood? Yes, sir. How long have you been investigating this? 3 months, sir, since I arrived at FOB Sentinel. Why? Rita had hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because it required revealing more about herself than she'd been willing to show. Sir, I was assigned here after requesting a low-profile posting. I wanted quiet. I wanted to step back from operational work and just do my job without complications. But you saw something, Scott had prompted. Yes, sir. My first week here, I noticed discrepancies in the supply manifests. Small ones at first, then larger, then patterns. She'd paused. I tried to ignore it. It wasn't my job to investigate. I wasn't here to make waves. I just wanted to keep my head down and you couldn't, Scott had finished. Because that's not who you are. No, sir, it's not. Scott had nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already known. Why didn't you report it immediately? I didn't have enough evidence, and Rita had glanced at Walsh, who was staring at the table. I didn't know who to trust. If this was systematic, it meant multiple people were involved. I needed to be certain before I reported it. So you spent 3 months building a case? Yes, sir. While being mocked, undermined, and isolated? Yes, sir. And when you finally had enough evidence, you sent it to multiple recipients, knowing it would likely end your career here. Rita had touched her bracelet unconsciously. Sir, some things are more important than career advancement. Scott had smiled then, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Yes, they are. He'd turned back to Walsh. Captain, you're under arrest. You'll be confined to quarters under guard pending formal charges. You have the right to remain silent and the right to legal representation. I suggest you exercise both. Walsh had looked up, his face ashen. What about her? He gestured weakly at Rita. She violated chain of command. She did exactly what she was supposed to do, Scott had said. She identified fraud, documented it properly, and reported it through appropriate channels. The fact that you were part of the fraud doesn't negate her obligation to report it. He'd moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Captain, the charges against Sergeant Reese are being dropped. All of them. If anything, she's due for a commendation. Walsh had slumped forward, his head in his hands. Scott had opened the door, where 2 military police officers had been waiting. Gentlemen, please escort Captain Walsh to his quarters and ensure he has no access to communication devices or computers. He's to remain under guard until further notice. The MPs had moved efficiently, flanking Walsh and guiding him out of the room. He'd gone without resistance, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. When they were gone, Scott had closed the door again and turned to Rita. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. 6 years, Scott had finally said. Yes, sir. I heard you requested discharge from the Special Operations Program, wanted a regular posting. I needed a break, sir. Mozambique was rough. Yes, sir, it was. Scott had nodded, understanding passing between them without need for elaboration. They'd both seen things in Mozambique that still woke them up at night. They'd both made calls that saved lives and cost lives. They'd both carried weight that never fully went away. You were one of the best I ever worked with, Scott had said quietly. I was sorry to see you go. Thank you, sir. But now I understand why you left. He gestured to the empty room, to the situation they'd just witnessed. You can't turn it off, can you? The ability to see patterns, to notice what doesn't fit, to question what everyone else accepts. Rita had smiled slightly. No, sir, I can't. Even when you try to hide. Even when you request the quietest, most boring posting you can find. Even then. Scott had walked to the window, looking out at the base. I'm about to ask you something, Reese, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. No pressure, no obligation, just an honest response. Yes, sir. He'd turned to face her. I need someone like you. Someone who can't ignore corruption when they see it. Someone who has the courage to stand alone against authority when authority is wrong. Someone who understands that doing the right thing often means losing friends, promotions, and comfort. He'd paused. I run a small unit. Officially, we're a financial oversight task force. Unofficially, we hunt down people who steal from soldiers. We investigate fraud, corruption, black market operations. We work in the shadows, we move quietly, and we don't stop until we've built cases that can't be dismissed or ignored. Rita had felt her pulse quicken. "Sir, I'm offering you a choice," Scott had said. "You can stay here at FOB Sentinel. The charges against you will be dropped. Your record will be cleared. Captain Walsh will be replaced, and you'll be reinstated to your supply position. You'll finish your deployment in peace, and no one will question your integrity again. Or you can come work for me. The job is harder, more dangerous in its way. You'll make powerful enemies. You'll spend your time investigating people who don't want to be investigated. You'll have to testify at courts-martial. Endure cross-examinations. Watch career officers call you a liar to your face." He'd smiled grimly. "But you'll also be doing something that matters. Something that protects soldiers who can't protect themselves from the people who are supposed to be leading them." Rita had looked down at her bracelet, at the pattern of black, crimson, and gold that had marked her as someone special 6 years ago. Someone who'd been tested in fire and found worthy. Someone who'd walked away from that life because it had taken too much from her. But could you ever really walk away? Or did you just carry it with you, looking for new battles to fight, new wrongs to right, new truths to defend? "Sir," she'd said slowly, "if I stay here, what happens to the investigation?" "It continues. We've identified several other people involved in the scheme. They'll all be prosecuted. The base will be cleaned up. And if I join your unit, then you'll help us clean up the next base, and the one after that, and the one after that. This problem, corruption, theft, fraud, it's everywhere, Reese. Every base has its Captain Walsh. Every supply chain has its vulnerabilities. We're just a small team trying to plug holes in a very large dam." Rita had walked to the window, standing beside Scott, looking out at FOB Sentinel. Somewhere out there, soldiers were going about their daily routines, unaware that their base had been corrupt, that their supplies had been stolen, that their lives had been put at risk for someone else's profit. They'd never know how close they'd come to disaster. Never know that Rita Reese, the quiet supply sergeant they'd mocked and dismissed, had been the only thing standing between them and catastrophe. "My mother used to say something," Rita had said quietly, "in Afrikaans. Die waarheid maak jou vrij, maar eers maak dit jou alleen. The truth will set you free, but first it will make you alone." Wise woman. She was. Rita had turned to face Scott. "Sir, I have one question before I answer." "Go ahead." "If I join your unit, will I have to pretend to be something I'm not? Will I have to hide who I am and what I believe?" Scott had met her eyes directly. "No. In fact, I'm specifically recruiting you because you can't pretend to be anything other than honest. That's your greatest strength, Reese. You're incapable of looking the other way. Some people would call that a weakness. I call it exactly what I need." Rita had felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness, of purpose, of being in exactly the place she was supposed to be. "Then I'm in, sir." Scott had extended his hand. "Welcome to the team, Sergeant Reese. Or should I say, Special Investigator Reese." They'd shaken hands, and Rita had felt the years fall away, the exhaustion of pretending to be ordinary, the weight of trying to hide her capabilities, the loneliness of standing alone against the crowd. She was done hiding. "When do I start?" "As soon as we finish here. We'll need your testimony for the courts-martial. You'll need to walk me through every piece of evidence you collected. And then," Scott had smiled, "then we move on to the next case. There's a supply depot in Germany that's showing some interesting discrepancies. I think you'll find it fascinating." Rita had smiled back, feeling alive in a way she hadn't felt in 6 years. "I already do, sir." Outside the conference room, word had begun to spread. Captain Walsh had been arrested. Some commander from Washington had shown up. Something big was happening. And Sergeant Rita Reese, the troublemaker, the complainer, the woman everyone had written off as too honest for her own good, was apparently at the center of it all. The base watched and waited, not yet understanding what they were about to witness, not yet understanding that everything was about to change. The next morning, Colonel Marsh ordered a full base assembly at 0900 hours. Mandatory attendance for all personnel not on critical duty. No exceptions. Rita stood in formation with the rest of the support personnel, her uniform crisp, her posture perfect, her face impassive. Around her, soldiers whispered and speculated. The rumor mill had been working overtime since Walsh's arrest, spinning theories that ranged from somewhat accurate to completely absurd. I heard he was selling supplies to terrorists. Someone said it's about sexual harassment. My buddy in comms said there's like 10 people about to get arrested. What does any of this have to do with Reese? Rita kept her eyes forward, saying nothing. Martinez stood 3 rows back, his expression carefully neutral, but when she'd passed him on the way to formation, he'd given her the smallest nod. Respect, acknowledgement. Welcome to the other side. The morning sun was already brutal, climbing toward another 100-degree day. The parade ground shimmered with heat waves, and soldiers shifted uncomfortably in their formations, sweating in their uniforms. 400 personnel assembled in neat ranks, facing a temporary stage that had been erected overnight. Colonel Marsh took the stage first, his face grim. He was a career officer, late 50s, with a reputation for running a tight ship. Rita had only met him once, briefly, during her initial in-processing. He'd seemed competent but distant, the kind of commander who managed through his subordinates rather than getting directly involved in daily operations. At ease, Marsh commanded, and 400 bodies shifted into a slightly less rigid stance. I'm not going to waste anyone's time with lengthy preamble. Yesterday, Captain James Walsh was arrested on charges of fraud, theft of military property, and conspiracy. The investigation is ongoing, but I want to address this immediately because I will not have rumors and speculation undermining the integrity of this command. A murmur rippled through the formation. Marsh waited for silence before continuing. For the past 18 months, FOB Sentinel has been the target of a systematic theft operation. Medical supplies, equipment, vehicle parts, and other materials have been deliberately diverted and sold for personal profit. The financial damage is estimated at over $2 million. The operational damage, the risk to soldier safety from missing equipment, is incalculable. The murmur grew louder. Marsh raised his hand for silence. I have asked Commander David Scott, who led the investigation, to brief you on what was discovered and what actions are being taken. Commander Scott. Scott took the stage, and Rita felt the shift in attention. Where Marsh projected authority through rank and position, Scott projected something else. Competence, perhaps, or certainty. He looked like someone who'd seen things, done things, and come back stronger for it. Thank you, Colonel. Scott's voice carried clearly across the parade ground without seeming to strain. I'm going to be direct because I believe you deserve to know exactly what happened here and how it's being addressed. He pressed a button on a remote, and a large screen behind him illuminated with an organizational chart. Captain Walsh was the primary architect of a fraud scheme that involved at least 6 other personnel at this base, plus multiple civilian contractors off base. The scheme worked like this. Legitimate supply orders were inflated or duplicated. The extra supplies were diverted to a civilian company owned by Walsh's brother-in-law. That company then sold the supplies on the commercial market. The profits were split among the conspirators. The chart showed connections, names, dollar amounts, transaction dates. Rita recognized several of the names. Corporal Jennings was on the list, Specialist Chen, 2 supply contractors she'd worked with. The scheme was sophisticated, Scott continued. It used legitimate paperwork, exploited gaps in the supply chain tracking system, and relied on the assumption that no one would look closely enough to notice the patterns. It might have continued indefinitely if not for one person who did look closely. One person who noticed the discrepancies documented them meticulously and refused to be silent even when pressured to do so. Scott paused, and Rita felt 400 pairs of eyes suddenly realize where this was going. Sergeant Rita Reese identified the fraud 3 months ago. She spent those 3 months carefully building evidence while enduring harassment, mockery, and professional isolation. When she finally reported her findings through proper channels, Captain Walsh attempted to have her discharged for insubordination. Instead, her report reached my office, and we launched a formal investigation. The parade ground was absolutely silent now. You could have heard a pin drop on the concrete. "I want to be very clear about something," Scott said, his voice harder now. "Sergeant Reese did everything right. She followed regulations. She documented her findings. She reported through proper channels. She maintained her integrity even when it would have been easier, much easier, to look the other way. And she did all of this while being actively undermined by the very people who were supposed to be her leaders." Scott's eyes swept across the formation, and Rita saw several soldiers shift uncomfortably. "I understand that some of you participated in that undermining. Some of you mocked her. Some of you called her a troublemaker, said she couldn't handle military reality, suggested she didn't understand how things work." Scott's voice was cutting now. "So let me tell you how things work. In the military, we depend on each other for survival. When someone steals supplies, they're stealing from every soldier who might need those supplies in an emergency. When someone falsifies maintenance records, they're putting lives at risk. And when someone tries to silence the person reporting that theft, they're betraying every value the uniform represents." Rita kept her face neutral, but she felt something warm spreading through her chest. Vindication, recognition, justice. Scott gestured to the screen. 6 people have been arrested so far. More arrests are likely as the investigation continues. All of them will face courts-martial. All of them will likely go to prison. This is not a situation where anyone gets a slap on the wrist and a transfer. This is criminal behavior that endangered soldiers, and it will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of military law. He turned off the screen and faced the formation directly. "But there's something else you need to understand. This didn't happen in a vacuum. Captain Walsh didn't operate alone. He had help, not just from the people who directly participated in the scheme, but from all of you who created an environment where someone like Sergeant Reese could be mocked and dismissed for doing the right thing." The silence was crushing now. Uncomfortable, Rita could feel the mood shifting, people realizing they'd been on the wrong side of this story. "Military culture," Scott said, "is built on values, honor, courage, commitment, integrity. But those aren't just words we put on motivational posters. They're standards we're supposed to live by every single day. And when we create an environment where someone gets punished for upholding those standards, we've failed, not as individuals, as a unit." Scott paused, letting that sink in. Sergeant Reese could have looked the other way. She could have kept her head down, finished her deployment quietly, and let someone else deal with the problem. No one would have blamed her. No one would have known. But she didn't do that. She stood up, alone, against pressure and mockery and professional destruction because she believed, correctly, that protecting her fellow soldiers was more important than protecting her career. Scott turned toward Rita's section of the formation. "Sergeant Reese, front and center." Rita's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't in the plan. Scott hadn't mentioned anything about... "That's an order, Sergeant." Rita stepped out of formation and marched to the stage, her boots striking the concrete in perfect rhythm. She mounted the stairs and came to attention facing Scott, painfully aware of 400 people watching her every move. Scott's expression was unreadable. "Sergeant Reese, I'm going to ask you some questions. Answer honestly." "Yes, sir." "When you first reported the supply discrepancies to Captain Walsh, what did he order you to do?" Rita's throat was dry. "Sir, he ordered me to withdraw my report and falsify the records to show the missing supplies as in transit." "And you refused?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" Because it would have been a violation of regulations and my oath, sir. I swore to support and defend the Constitution and to obey the orders of the officers appointed over me. But that oath doesn't include following illegal orders. Scott nodded. When you were publicly humiliated for raising safety concerns about vehicle medical kits, you could have backed down. Why didn't you? Rita chose her words carefully. Sir, my job is to ensure soldiers have the equipment they need to survive. If I stay silent about missing safety equipment because it's uncomfortable or unpopular to speak up, then I'm failing in that job. I'm failing the soldiers who depend on that equipment. Even when speaking up costs you everything? Rita touched her bracelet unconsciously, feeling the familiar pattern. Sir, my mother used to tell me that the cost of silence is always higher than the cost of truth. She was right. Scott turned to address the formation again, but his next words were clearly for everyone to hear. Sergeant Reese is from South Africa originally. She joined the South African National Defense Force at 18, served with distinction, and transferred to the U.S. Army at 22 through a specialized program. What most of you don't know, what Sergeant Reese has never discussed, is why she qualified for that specialized program. Rita's breath caught. He was going to... 6 years ago, Scott continued, there was a counter-terrorism operation in Mozambique. It's still classified, so I can't give you details. What I can tell you is that it was a joint operation between South African and American Special Forces. The operation was successful. Lives were saved. A major terrorist attack was prevented. And one of the key operators who made that success possible was a 23-year-old sergeant from Cape Town who displayed exceptional courage, skill, and judgment under the most extreme circumstances. Scott reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. At the end of that operation, I personally gave that sergeant a token of recognition. A bracelet woven from paracord in a specific pattern, black for operating in darkness, crimson for the blood we prevented from being shed, gold for the integrity that guided every decision. He held up his own wrist, and Rita saw it, a bracelet identical to hers, worn and faded, but unmistakable. I wear mine as a reminder, Scott said. A reminder that there are still people in this world who will do the right thing, no matter the cost. People who can't be bought, can't be intimidated, can't be convinced to compromise their principles for convenience. He turned to Rita. Sergeant Reese wears hers for the same reason, and for the past 3 months, while you were calling her a troublemaker, she was doing exactly what she was trained to do, identifying threats, building cases, and protecting people who didn't even know they needed protecting. Scott came to attention and rendered a crisp salute. Rita's eyes widened. A commander saluting an enlisted soldier was almost unheard of. It reversed the normal order. It was a public statement of respect that transcended rank. Instinctively, Rita returned the salute, her hand snapping to her brow with parade ground precision. Behind them, Colonel Marsh stepped forward and saluted as well. Then, one by one, the soldiers in formation began to follow suit. It started with Martinez. He'd stepped out of formation and rendered a sharp salute, his face showing none of the emotion Rita suspected he was feeling. Then Sergeant Davies next to him. Then Private Torres, looking almost defiant as he saluted. Within seconds, the entire formation was saluting. 400 soldiers. Hands raised in recognition, acknowledging the woman they'd mocked and dismissed. Rita held her salute, fighting to keep her expression professional, fighting to keep the tears that burned behind her eyes from falling. This wasn't just vindication. This was something deeper. This was her fellow soldiers acknowledging that she'd been right, that she'd stood alone and survived, that she'd protected them when they hadn't protected her. Scott lowered his salute, and the ripple effect followed, 400 hands dropping back to sides in a wave of motion. Sergeant Reese has been reassigned to my unit, Scott announced. She'll be working with a specialized task force that investigates military fraud and corruption. She'll continue to do exactly what she did here, finding problems that others miss, asking questions that others avoid, and ensuring that the soldiers who depend on military systems can trust those systems to work. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the formation one more time. I want every one of you to remember this moment. Remember that when someone stands up for what's right, your job isn't to tear them down. Your job is to stand up with them. Remember that integrity isn't convenient. It's not popular. It's not easy. But it's the foundation everything else is built on. And remember that the woman you mocked for being too honest was the only thing standing between you and a commander who was stealing your supplies, falsifying your records, and putting your lives at risk. Scott turned to Rita. "Dismissed, Sergeant. And thank you." Rita saluted one more time, executed a perfect about-face, and marched off the stage. As she descended the stairs, she heard it, starting quietly but building quickly. Applause. It was against protocol during a formation. Someone should have stopped it. But no one did. The applause grew louder, spreading through the ranks, 400 pairs of hands coming together in recognition that went beyond words. Rita returned to her position in formation, and the soldiers around her, the same ones who'd whispered about her, who'd laughed at her, who'd avoided her, nodded their respect. One by one, small gestures, a nod here, a murmured, "Good job, Sergeant," there. It wasn't enough to erase the past 3 months, but it was something. As Scott and Colonel Marsh concluded the assembly with procedural information about the ongoing investigation, Rita stood at attention and felt the weight of the past 3 months finally lift from her shoulders. She'd been right. She'd stood alone. She'd survived. And now, finally, people knew the truth. After the formation was dismissed, Rita had started walking back toward her quarters when she heard footsteps behind her. "Sergeant Reese, ma'am, wait." She turned to find Corporal Jennings, one of Walsh's favorites, one of the soldiers who'd mocked her most consistently. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Corporal, He swallowed hard. "I wanted to apologize for the things I said, for laughing when Captain Walsh was... I didn't know. I should have..." "You should have listened," Rita said, not unkindly. "You should have asked questions instead of assuming. You should have stood up instead of going along." "Yes, ma'am. I know that now." Rita studied him for a moment. He was young, 22, maybe 23, still figuring out what kind of soldier, what kind of man he wanted to be. She could be harsh, drive the lesson home with anger and recrimination, or she could be something else. "Corporal Jennings, can I give you some advice?" "Yes, ma'am." "There will be other Captain Walshes in your career, other situations where someone in authority is doing something wrong and expecting you to go along with it. When those moments come, you'll have a choice. You can be the person who laughs and follows, or you can be the person who questions and stands firm. That choice will define who you are more than any test score or fitness evaluation ever will." Jennings nodded slowly. "I understand, ma'am, for what it's worth. I'm glad you were here. I'm glad you did what you did." "So am I, Corporal. So am I." He saluted, unnecessarily, but clearly feeling it was important, and walked away. Rita continued toward her quarters, but she didn't make it far before others approached. Private Torres, who'd been the only one to help her during her confinement. Specialist Hammond, who'd called her a logistics ninja. Even Sergeant Davies, who'd supervised her in the supply depot and had never actively participated in the mockery, but had never stopped it either. One by one they came, some to apologize, some to thank her, some just to acknowledge what she'd done. By the time she reached her container quarters, 40 minutes had passed, and her face hurt from maintaining a professional expression. She closed the door, locked it, and sat on her narrow bed. Then, finally alone, Rita Reese put her face in her hands and cried. Not from sadness, not from anger, from release and from the sheer overwhelming relief of finally being vindicated, of having the truth seen and acknowledged, of knowing that her mother's words, "The truth will set you free," had proven accurate once again. She cried for 3 minutes, allowing herself that release, then wiped her eyes, washed her face, and got back to work. Because Commander Scott would be expecting her briefing on the Germany case soon, and there were more soldiers who needed protecting. The next 72 hours transformed FOB Sentinel in ways both visible and invisible.
The visible changes came first. Captain Walsh's office was sealed by the military police, yellow tape across the door while investigators catalogued evidence. Corporal Jennings, Specialist Chen, and 4 others were confined to quarters pending their own courts-martial proceedings.
The supply depot underwent a complete inventory audit, with teams working around the clock to account for every item, reconcile every discrepancy, establish the true scope of the theft. But it was the invisible changes that Rita noticed most. The way soldiers moved aside to let her pass in hallways, not from fear, but from respect. The way conversations paused when she entered the mess hall, not from hostility, but from awareness. An acknowledgement that she was someone who'd done something significant. The way junior enlisted personnel began approaching her with questions, not about supplies, but about courage. "Sergeant Reese, can I ask you something?" Private Miller had approached her on the second day after the assembly, the same Miller who'd been laughing with Jennings about her being too honest just a week ago. "How did you know it would work out? When you sent that email, how did you know you wouldn't just get discharged and that would be the end of it?" Rita had been organizing files in the temporary office she'd been assigned while her permanent workspace was processed. She'd looked up at Miller, seeing genuine curiosity in his young face. "I didn't know," she'd admitted. "I hoped it would, but I didn't know for certain." "Then why risk it?" Rita had set down the folder she'd been holding. "Miller, let me ask you something. If you were deployed and got injured, and you reached for the medical kit in your vehicle, and it was empty, no tourniquets, no supplies that could save your life, how would you feel knowing that someone had noticed it was empty, but stayed silent because speaking up might be uncomfortable?" Miller had paled slightly. I'd be pretty angry." "Exactly. I couldn't be that person who stayed silent. Not because I'm brave or special, but because I couldn't live with myself if my silence cost someone their life." Miller had nodded slowly. "That makes sense. Thank you, Sergeant." He'd walked away, and Rita had returned to her files, but she'd felt satisfied. One more person who might ask questions in the future. One more person who might stand up when it mattered. On the third day, Rita had been working through the afternoon when Martinez had knocked on her doorframe. "Got a minute?" "For you?" "Always, Sergeant." Martinez had entered, closing the door behind him. He'd looked older somehow, the past few days having added weight to his already weathered features. He'd pulled something from his pocket and set it on Rita's desk, a USB drive. "The one I gave you through Torres," he'd said. "Figured you'd want to return it now that the investigation is official." Rita had picked up the drive, turning it over in her hands. "You took a risk, giving me this. If Walsh had found out—" "Walsh isn't the first corrupt officer I've seen," Martinez had interrupted, "and he won't be the last. But you—" He'd paused, choosing his words carefully. "You're the first person I've met in a long time who reminded me why I joined in the first place, why any of us join. To serve? To protect. To stand for something that matters." Martinez had gestured to the bracelet on Rita's wrist. "I knew someone else who wore one of those. Afghanistan, 2012. He was part of a team that—" He'd trailed off, shaking his head. "Classified." "You understand." "I do. He told me once that the people who wear those bracelets can't help themselves. They see problems and they have to fix them. They see injustice and they have to fight it, even when it would be smarter, safer, easier to look away." Martinez had met her eyes. He was killed in 2014, IED in Kandahar, but before he died, he told me something. He said, "Find the people who can't look away. Protect them when you can, because they're the ones who protect everyone else." Rita had felt her throat tighten. "What was his name?" "Captain Andrew Reeves. Did you know him?" Rita had shaken her head. "No, but I wish I had." "He'd have liked you." Martinez had moved toward the door, then paused. "Reese, I'm retiring in 8 months, 25 years, that'll be enough. But before I go, I want to make sure this base is squared away. Really squared away. Not just following regulations because we have to, but because we understand why those regulations exist. Think you could help with that before you ship out to Commander Scott's unit?" Rita had smiled. "I think I could manage that, Sergeant." "Good." Martinez had opened the door, then looked back one more time. "You did good, Reese. Better than good. You reminded a lot of people what integrity looks like. Don't lose that." "I won't." After Martinez had left, Rita had sat for several minutes just holding the USB drive, thinking about Captain Andrew Reeves, a man she'd never met, but who'd apparently been part of the same brotherhood of principled warriors, the ones who wore bracelets with black, crimson, and gold, the ones who couldn't look away. She'd opened her laptop and searched the name in the military database. The obituary had been brief, official, giving no hint of the man behind the rank. But the commendations listed told their own story. Bronze Star with Valor Device, Purple Heart, Army Commendation Medal, a career cut short but lived with honor. Rita had touched her bracelet, sending a silent acknowledgement to a fallen brother she'd never known. We carry on. We keep fighting. We don't look away. The fourth day brought a visitor Rita hadn't expected. She'd been reviewing supply requisitions in her office when there'd been a knock, tentative, almost apologetic. She'd looked up to find Lieutenant Briggs standing in the doorway, the young JAG officer who'd been present when Walsh had been arrested. "Sergeant Reese, do you have a moment?" "Of course, sir. Please." "Come in." Briggs had entered, looking uncomfortable. He'd been carrying a folder, holding it like it might contain something dangerous. "I wanted to apologize to you personally. When Captain Walsh briefed me on your case, he painted you as someone who was unstable and disruptive. I should have investigated more thoroughly before accepting his characterization. I should have looked at the evidence myself rather than taking his word." Rita had gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sir, you were given information by a superior officer. It's natural to trust that information." "Natural, maybe, but not right." Briggs had sat down, still clutching the folder. "I've been practicing military law for 2 years now, and this is the first time I've really understood how easily the system can be manipulated, how someone with authority can use that authority to bury the truth." He'd looked at Rita directly. "You could have been destroyed. If Commander Scott hadn't shown up, if your report hadn't reached the right people, Walsh could have had you discharged, and no one would have questioned it." "I know. That doesn't frighten you?" Rita had considered the question. "It frightens me, sir, but not enough to make me act differently. My mother used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's deciding that something else is more important than fear." Briggs had opened the folder, revealing a legal document. "I've been authorized to inform you that all charges that were being considered against you have been formally dismissed. Additionally, you're being awarded the Army Commendation Medal for identifying and reporting the fraud scheme, and for maintaining your integrity under extreme pressure." He'd slid the document across the desk. Rita had scanned it, seeing official seals and signatures. "There's something else," Briggs had continued. "The Judge Advocate General's office has asked if you'd be willing to testify at the courts-martial proceedings, not just about what you discovered, but about the environment that allowed the fraud to flourish, about the culture of silence and intimidation. They want me to testify against Walsh specifically?" "Walsh, yes. But also about the systemic issues, how people were discouraged from asking questions, how those who did speak up were punished." Briggs had leaned forward slightly. "Sergeant, your testimony could help ensure that not only are the guilty parties punished, but that real reforms are implemented to prevent this from happening again." Rita had thought about that. Testifying would mean more time in the spotlight, more attention, more opportunities for people to paint her as vindictive or difficult. It would be easier to decline, to take her commendation, and move on to her new assignment with Commander Scott. But easy had never been her path. "Yes, sir. I'll testify." Briggs had smiled, genuine relief crossing his young features. "Thank you. I think your testimony will make a real difference." He'd stood to leave, then paused. "Can I ask you something? Off the record?" "Of course." "Do you ever regret it? Speaking up, I mean. Even now that you've been vindicated, do you ever wish you'd just kept quiet and avoided all the trouble?" Rita had touched her bracelet. feeling the pattern that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. "No, sir, never. Because every time I'm tempted to regret it, I think about the soldiers who won't die because the medical supplies they need will actually be there. The soldiers who won't be injured because their vehicle maintenance will be done properly. The soldiers who can trust that the system works because people are willing to fight to keep it working." She'd paused, then added, "My mother died when I was 16, cancer. In her last days, she told me something I've never forgotten. She said, 'Rita, die wereld het nie genoeg mensen wat opstaan voor wat reg is nie. Je moet een van hulle wees. The world doesn't have enough people who stand up for what's right. You must be one of them.'" Briggs had nodded slowly. "Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman." She was, and she was right. After Briggs had left, Rita had sat alone in her office, looking at the commendation paperwork. Army Commendation Medal. A line on her service record. A small piece of ribbon that represented months of isolation, mockery, and fear. Was it worth it? She'd looked at her bracelet again, remembering Mozambique, remembering the operation that had earned her this marker, remembering the lives saved because people had been willing to do hard things in hard circumstances. Yes, it was worth it. On the 5th day, Rita had found herself in the unlikely position of being sought out for advice. It had started with Private Torres, who'd asked her about a supply discrepancy he'd noticed in his unit's equipment logs. Then Specialist Hammond, who'd wanted to know if it was appropriate to report a safety violation he'd observed. Then others, one after another, junior enlisted personnel, who'd apparently decided that Rita Reese was someone they could trust with uncomfortable truths. By mid-afternoon, she'd spoken with 8 different soldiers, each bringing their own small concerns, their own questions about regulations and procedures, and what to do when something didn't seem right. She'd been patient with each of them, explaining proper channels, helping them understand what was worth reporting and what was genuinely just normal operational variance. She'd taught them how to document concerns, how to approach supervisors diplomatically, how to be persistent without being insubordinate. It had reminded her of something Commander Scott had said years ago in Mozambique. During a quiet moment after a particularly difficult mission, leadership isn't about rank, Reese. It's about who people turn to when they need someone to help them do the right thing. Rita hadn't thought of herself as a leader then. She'd been 23, relatively inexperienced, still figuring out her place in the military hierarchy. But Scott had seen something in her, had recognized a quality that transcended rank or position. Now, sitting in her temporary office at FOB Sentinel, she'd finally understood what he'd meant. People didn't come to her because she was an officer or a senior NCO. They came because they trusted her to care more about truth than politics, more about soldiers than systems, more about doing right than doing easy. That was leadership, not the kind that came with rank insignia, but the kind that had to be earned through consistent action. On the 6th day, Commander Scott had summoned Rita to a briefing. They'd met in Colonel Marsh's conference room, the same room where Rita had first been confronted about her troublemaking, and where, days later, Scott had arrested Captain Walsh. The space felt different now, cleaner somehow, as if the exposure of corruption had purified the air. Scott had spread several folders across the table, each labeled with different locations: Germany, South Korea, Kuwait, Italy. "These are our active cases," he'd explained. "Each location is showing signs of supply chain irregularities similar to what you identified here. Not identical. These operations are smarter, more sophisticated, but the patterns are there if you know how to look." Rita had leaned forward, scanning the summary sheets. Her mind had automatically started processing the information, identifying connections, noting discrepancies. "The Germany case," she'd said, pointing to one folder. "These parts requisitions. They're using a different methodology than Walsh used, but the end result is the same. They're inflating repair costs and pocketing the difference." "That's our assessment too," Scott had confirmed. "We need someone to go in undercover, work in their supply system, and build the case from the inside." "When do I leave?" Scott had smiled. 2 weeks. You'll need briefings first. Germany's operation is more complex. They've got civilian contractors involved, multiple bases in the network, and at least one officer with significant political connections. It'll be dangerous in a different way than this was. Not physical danger, but career danger. If you're discovered investigating before we have solid evidence, they'll bury you so deep you'll never dig out. I understand, sir. I need to know you're ready for this, Reese. What happened here at Sentinel, that was one base, one relatively unsophisticated operation. What we're moving into is bigger, more organized. These people have resources and connections. They will fight back. Rita had looked at the folders, at the evidence of corruption spreading like cancer through the military supply system. She'd thought about all the soldiers who depended on that system, all the lives at risk when equipment failed or supplies were missing, all the small betrayals that added up to catastrophic failure when crisis came. Sir, I'm ready. This is what I'm trained for. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. Scott had studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Yes, it is. Welcome to the team, Special Investigator Reese. Your first assignment is officially Germany, but before then, I need you to help me finish up here. There are still people at this base who were involved in Walsh's operation, people we haven't identified yet. I need your eyes on the personnel files, on the supply records, on anything that might help us root out the last of the corruption. Consider it done, sir. They'd worked for the next 3 hours, Rita systematically going through files and records, identifying patterns Scott's team had missed. She'd found 2 more suspects, a supply contractor who'd processed suspiciously high numbers of emergency orders, and a logistics sergeant who'd been signing off on deliveries without proper documentation. By the time they'd finished, the sun had been setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple. Scott had stretched, his back cracking. You know what I appreciate about you, Reese? Sir? You don't do this for recognition or advancement. You don't do it to prove you're better than anyone else. You do it because you genuinely can't stand watching people get away with stealing from soldiers. He'd paused. That's rare. Most investigators I work with are competent, dedicated, professional. But they're doing a job. You're on a mission. There's a difference. Rita had considered that. My mother once told me that everyone has a purpose. Some people find it easily, others search their whole lives. But when you find yours, you recognize it immediately because it feels like coming home. And this feels like coming home? Yes, sir, it does. Scott had smiled. Good, because we've got a lot of work ahead of us. On the 7th day, Rita had been approached by Colonel Marsh himself. She'd been inspecting the supply depot, old habits dying hard, when Marsh had appeared, walking the aisles alone without the usual entourage of aides and assistants. Sergeant Reese, walk with me. They'd walked together through the aisles of equipment and supplies, past pallets of MREs and rows of spare parts, through the organized chaos of military logistics. I owe you an apology, Marsh had said finally. Not just for the way you were treated, but for the fact that I didn't notice what was happening under my command. I should have seen the patterns. I should have been asking the questions you were asking. Sir, you can't personally oversee every aspect of— That's not an excuse. Marsh had stopped walking, turning to face her. I'm the commander. Everything that happens here is ultimately my responsibility. The fact that Captain Walsh was able to operate his scheme for 18 months without me noticing is a failure on my part, a failure that put soldiers at risk. Rita had seen the genuine remorse in his face, the weight of command sitting heavy on his shoulders. Sir, if I may, you did notice. As soon as evidence was presented to you, you acted. You brought in Commander Scott, you authorized a full investigation. You didn't try to cover it up or minimize it. That's not failure. That's leadership. Marsh had studied her for a moment. You're generous, Sergeant. More generous than I deserve. He'd resumed walking, and Rita had fallen into step beside him. Commander Scott tells me you're joining his task force. That's good. We need people like you identifying and stopping these operations before they become entrenched. I'll do my best, sir. I know you will. Marsh had paused at the depot exit, looking back at the organized rows of supplies. Before you leave Sentinel, I want you to know something. What you did here, standing alone, refusing to back down, maintaining your integrity in the face of overwhelming pressure, that's going to be remembered, not just by the soldiers here, but throughout the command structure. You've set an example that will influence how people approach similar situations for years to come. That's not why I did it, sir. I know, which is exactly why it matters. Marsh had extended his hand. Thank you, Sergeant Reese, for your courage, for your service, for reminding us all what it means to wear the uniform honorably. They'd shaken hands, and Rita had felt the weight of recognition from someone whose respect actually meant something. On the final evening before her departure, Rita had sat in her container quarters, packing her belongings with the same methodical precision she'd used when arriving 3 months ago. It felt like a lifetime ago. She'd been someone different then, someone trying to hide, trying to disappear into comfortable obscurity, someone who'd thought she could leave her past behind and just be a regular soldier doing regular work. She'd been naive. You couldn't unlearn what you'd learned, couldn't unsee what you'd seen, couldn't stop being who you fundamentally were. There'd been a knock on her door. Rita had opened it to find Martinez standing there with a bottle and 2 glasses. "Thought you might want some company your last night here," he'd said. "Non-alcoholic before you ask. Just sparkling cider. Can't have you shipping out with a hangover." Rita had smiled and invited him in. They'd sat on her small bed and the single chair, drinking cider from plastic cups, talking about everything and nothing. "You're going to do good work with Scott's team," Martinez had said eventually. "Important work." "I hope so. I know so." Martinez had refilled their glasses. "Can I tell you something? When I first saw you, first noticed that bracelet, I thought maybe you were running from something, hiding, trying to escape whatever you'd been part of. I was. But you can't run from yourself. You can't hide from what you're meant to do." Rita had nodded slowly. "No, you can't. I'm glad you figured that out here. I'm glad this base got to be where you remembered who you are." They'd sat in comfortable silence for a while, 2 soldiers who'd found common ground in the uncommon choice to stand for principle over convenience. Finally, Martinez had stood to leave. At the door, he'd turned back. "Reese, when you're out there doing this work, investigating, building cases, standing up to powerful people, remember that you're not alone. There are others like you, like us. Maybe not many, but enough. And we're all counting on each other to keep fighting the good fight." "I'll remember, Sergeant. Thank you for everything." After Martinez had left, Rita had finished packing. Everything she owned fit into 2 duffel bags and a small backpack, traveling light, always ready to move. She'd taken one last look around the container that had been home for 3 months. She wouldn't miss it, but she wouldn't forget it either. This was where she'd remembered who she was, where she'd rediscovered her purpose. Rita had touched her bracelet one final time, feeling the familiar pattern. Black, crimson, gold, darkness, blood, integrity. Tomorrow, she'd leave for her next assignment. More corruption to uncover, more soldiers to protect, more battles to fight in the shadows where paperwork and regulations replaced bullets and bombs. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself at 18, standing in the recruitment office in Cape Town. It wasn't the quiet, simple existence she'd tried to build for herself after Mozambique, but it was her life, her purpose, her calling, and she was ready for it. 6 months later, Rita Reese stood in a different briefing room, on a different base, in a different country, delivering a presentation that would end another career and protect hundreds more soldiers. Ramstein Air Base, Germany. Winter had settled over the countryside, covering the landscape in a blanket of white that seemed almost peaceful. But inside the secure briefing facility, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. Rita advanced to the next slide, showing a network diagram that connected supply contractors, maintenance personnel, and 3 separate officers across 4 U.S. military installations in Europe. The scheme operates on a larger scale than what we saw at FOB Sentinel, she explained to the assembled investigators and JAG officers. Rather than one commander stealing supplies, this is a coordinated network that spans multiple bases. They're using legitimate NATO supply protocols to mask the theft, which makes it significantly more sophisticated. Commander Scott stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, watching Rita work with visible satisfaction. She'd grown into her role as special investigator over the past 6 months, developing an instinct for the work that came from natural ability combined with relentless dedication. Rita clicked to the next slide. Financial records that showed millions of euros in fraudulent transactions. The total loss is estimated at 4.2 million euros over 2 years. But the operational impact is what concerns us most. The medical supplies alone. She'd been interrupted by a knock on the door. A military police officer had entered, whispered something to Scott, and handed him a folder. Scott had opened it, scanned the contents, and smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just received confirmation that arrest warrants have been issued for all 12 suspects. Simultaneous raids are being conducted as we speak across 4 installations." The room had erupted in quiet celebration. Professional, but genuine. 2 years of investigation, 8 months of Rita's direct involvement, countless hours of document review and evidence gathering, all culminating in this moment. Rita had felt the familiar satisfaction that came with completion. Another case closed. Another group of corrupt officers stopped. Another set of soldiers protected from those who would betray their trust. After the briefing, Scott had pulled Rita aside. "Good work, again." "Thank you, sir. I'm putting you in for another commendation. That's 3 in 6 months. You're becoming something of a legend in certain circles." Rita had smiled slightly. "I'm just doing the job, sir." "No, you're exceeding the job. There's a difference." Scott had paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I've been authorized to expand the task force. We're bringing on 6 more investigators. I want you to help train them. Teach them how you think, how you spot patterns, how you build cases that can't be dismissed." "Me, sir? I've only been doing this for 6 months. And in that 6 months, you've closed 4 major cases, identified 17 suspects, and recovered over $6 million in stolen military property. You have an instinct for this work that can't be taught from textbooks. I need you to share that with the new team." Rita had thought about that. Training others, passing on what she'd learned, creating more people who could do this work, who could stand up when standing up was difficult. "I'd be honored, sir." "Good. The new team arrives next month. Until then, we've got another case that just landed on my desk. Naples, Italy, Navy supply base showing unusual equipment losses. Interested?" Rita had smiled. "Always, sir." That evening, Rita had video called home for the first time in weeks. Not to South Africa, she had no family left there, but to the place that had become home in a different way. The screen had connected, and she'd seen Martinez's weathered face, slightly pixelated but unmistakably him. "Reese, how's Europe treating you?" "Cold, complicated, fulfilling." Martinez had laughed. "Sounds about right. You wrapping up that Germany case?" "Wrapped. 12 arrests today." "Outstanding." Martinez had shifted, and Rita had seen he was in what looked like a classroom. "Hold on, let me show you something." He'd panned the camera to show a room full of junior enlisted soldiers, all sitting at desks, all watching attentively. "This is our new ethics and integrity training course," Martinez had explained. "Mandatory for all new arrivals at Sentinel. We spend a full day teaching them about fraud indicators, proper reporting channels, and what to do when they see something that doesn't seem right." He'd panned back to himself. "I tell them about you, about what you did, how you stood alone and why it mattered. You've become our example of what right looks like." Rita had felt emotion tighten her throat. "Sergeant, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep fighting the good fight. Because every time you close one of these cases, every time you protect soldiers from corrupt leadership, you're proving that the system can work when good people refuse to give up on it." They talked for another 20 minutes, catching up on base gossip and mutual friends. Martinez had told her that Torres had been promoted, that Hammond had put in for a transfer to Special Forces, that even Jennings, after serving his punishment for his minor role in Walsh's scheme, had become one of the most vocal advocates for supply chain integrity. "People change," Martinez had said, "when they see what right looks like. When they see someone willing to pay the price for principle, it changes them. You did that, Reese. You changed this place." After they'd disconnected, Rita had sat in her small apartment off base, looking out at the German winter night, thinking about change and purpose and the strange paths that led us to where we were meant to be. 3 months later, Rita had been in Naples, deep into the investigation, when she'd received an unexpected call. It had been Lieutenant Briggs, the young JAG officer from FOB Sentinel. "Special Investigator Reese, I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, sir. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to update you on the Walsh case. The courts-martial concluded last week." Rita had set down the file she'd been reviewing, giving Briggs her full attention. "What was the verdict?" "Guilty on all counts. Walsh got 22 years in military prison, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and benefits. Jennings and Chen got lighter sentences, 3 years and 2 years respectively, because they cooperated and their involvement was more limited. The civilian contractors are facing federal charges in civilian court." That's good news." "It is, but there's more. The investigation you triggered didn't just stop with Walsh. The Army Inspector General used your documentation methodology as a template. They've launched similar investigations at 17 other installations. 6 have already resulted in arrests. Your work, Special Investigator, your work has had ripple effects far beyond FOB Sentinel." Rita had absorbed that information slowly. 17 installations, 6 arrests, hundreds, maybe thousands of soldiers protected because she'd refused to stay silent. "Thank you for letting me know, sir. There's something else. Your testimony at the courts-martial, the way you explained not just what happened, but why it mattered, why integrity in supply chains directly impacts soldier safety. It's being used in training now. At JAG school, at officer basic courses, at senior leadership seminars. You've become a case study in moral courage." After Briggs had hung up, Rita had sat for a long time, processing the information. She'd never sought recognition, never wanted to be a symbol or an example. She'd just wanted to do right. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the best examples were the ones who never tried to be examples, the ones who just quietly, persistently, stubbornly did what was right because they couldn't imagine doing anything else. 1 year after leaving FOB Sentinel, Rita had been invited back. Commander Scott had arranged it, a brief visit during a layover on the way to a new assignment in South Korea. It hadn't been required, hadn't been necessary for any case or investigation, but Scott had thought it would be meaningful. He'd been right. Rita had walked through the base, and it had been like visiting a place she'd known in a previous life. The physical layout was the same buildings, same dusty roads, same desert heat. But the atmosphere was completely different. Soldiers had recognized her, stopping to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her how things had changed. The supply depot had a new transparency protocol with regular audits and public posting of inventory status. The motor pool had implemented new maintenance verification procedures. The entire base had a new culture, one where asking questions was encouraged, where reporting irregularities was respected, where integrity was reinforced rather than mocked. Martinez had given her a tour, showing off the changes with obvious pride. "We're not perfect," he'd admitted. "Still have issues, still have people who cut corners, but the difference is now people speak up. Now when someone sees something wrong, they report it, because they saw what happens when someone has the courage to stand up. They saw you." They'd ended the tour at the supply depot, where a plaque had been mounted on the wall. Rita had stared at it in surprise. "In recognition of SSG Rita Reese, who demonstrated that integrity is not optional, who proved that one voice speaking truth is stronger than a chorus of convenient lies, who reminded us that our first duty is to the soldiers we serve. FOB Sentinel, 2024. "I didn't know about this," Rita had said quietly. Colonel Marsh ordered it installed after the courts-martial concluded, wanted to make sure every soldier who works in this depot remembers what happened here, remembers that doing right matters more than doing easy. Rita had touched the plaque, feeling the engraved letters beneath her fingertips. Her mother would have been proud, would have said something in Afrikaans about truth and courage and standing firm when storms come. "Thank you, Sergeant, for everything you did to support me." Martinez had shaken his head. "I didn't do anything except give you evidence you would have found eventually anyway. You did the hard part. You stood alone." "I wasn't alone. Not really. I had you watching my back. I had Commander Scott believing in me. I had my mother's voice in my head reminding me who I was supposed to be." "Your mother sounds like she was an incredible woman." "She was, and she taught me something I think about every day." Rita had turned from the plaque to face Martinez directly. "She taught me that we don't get to choose whether we face difficult moments. We only get to choose who we are in those moments, whether we bend to convenience or stand for principle, whether we protect ourselves or protect others, whether we become who we want to be or who circumstances pressure us to be." Martinez had nodded slowly. "That's wisdom worth remembering. It's wisdom worth living." That night, Rita had stood on the same patch of desert where she'd once stood at attention, clutching a manila envelope, being publicly humiliated by Captain Walsh while a crowd had laughed. The desert was quiet now, stars scattered across the black sky in patterns that seemed almost infinite. The temperature had dropped the way desert nights do, and Rita had pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. She'd thought about the journey that had brought her here, from Cape Town to Johannesburg to Mozambique to FOB Sentinel to Germany to Naples and points beyond. Each step had seemed random at the time, but looking back, she could see the pattern, could see how each experience had prepared her for the next, how each test had strengthened her for greater challenges. She'd thought about her mother, gone now for 13 years, but still present in every decision Rita made, every stand she took, every moment when choosing right over easy defined who she was. She'd thought about Captain Walsh, sitting in a military prison, his career destroyed, his family shamed, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the price of betrayal. She'd felt no satisfaction in his fall, only a quiet sadness that he'd chosen so poorly, that he'd traded honor for money and lost everything that mattered in the process. She'd thought about the soldiers, the ones at FOB Sentinel, the ones in Germany, the ones in Italy, the ones at 17 other bases where investigations had been launched because she'd refused to stay silent. Soldiers who would never know her name, never know that she'd helped protect them, but who were safer because she'd been willing to stand when standing was hard, and she'd thought about the future, about the new investigators she'd trained, about the cases still unsolved, about all the Captain Walshes still operating in shadows, stealing from soldiers who trusted the system to work. There was so much work left to do. But that was okay, because Rita Reese had finally understood something fundamental about herself. She wasn't meant for quiet, wasn't meant for obscurity, wasn't meant to disappear into comfortable anonymity. She was meant for this, for standing in uncomfortable truths, for asking questions others wouldn't ask, for building cases that protected the vulnerable from the powerful, for being exactly what Commander Scott had seen in her 6 years ago in Mozambique, someone who couldn't look away when looking away would be easier. Rita touched her bracelet one more time, feeling the pattern that had become part of her identity. Black, crimson, gold, darkness, blood, integrity. She'd operated in darkness, investigating corruption hidden in paperwork and supply manifests. She'd prevented bloodshed, ensuring soldiers had the equipment they needed to survive. And she'd maintained her integrity, refusing to compromise even when compromise would have been simpler. This was who she was. This was who she'd always been, even when she'd tried to be someone else, and she was done apologizing for it. 2 years after the Fob Sentinel case, Special Investigator Rita Reese stood in the Pentagon, receiving the Defense Meritorious Service Medal from a 3-star general whose name she'd only known from briefings. Special Investigator Reese, the general had said, his voice carrying across the small ceremony room, has demonstrated extraordinary dedication to exposing and eliminating fraud within our military supply systems. Her work has directly resulted in 43 arrests, the recovery of over $20 million in stolen military property, and the implementation of new oversight protocols across 3 theaters of operation. The medal had been pinned to Rita's dress uniform, adding to the growing collection of ribbons that told the story of her unlikely career. Army Commendation Medal, Defense Meritorious Service Medal, decorations that represented not battlefield valor, but a different kind of courage. The courage to stand against authority, to challenge systems, to speak truth when silence would be safer. After the ceremony, Rita had found Commander Scott waiting for her in the hallway. "Congratulations, investigator. Well deserved." "Thank you, sir." Scott had gestured toward a quiet corner, away from the other attendees. "I have something for you. Orders for your next assignment." He'd handed her a folder. Rita had opened it, scanning the contents. "Afghanistan?" "There's a major supply hub near Kabul that's showing irregularities. Big ones. We suspect it's connected to black market sales to local militia groups. If we're right, this isn't just fraud. It's actively supporting enemy operations." Rita had felt the familiar surge of purpose. This was important. This was exactly what she was meant to be doing. "When do I leave?" 2 weeks. Plenty of time to get your affairs in order." Scott had paused, his expression growing more serious. "Reese, I want you to understand something. This assignment is dangerous. Not just career dangerous. Actually dangerous. If you're compromised, if the people running this operation realize you're investigating them, you could be at physical risk. I can't send you in with backup. You'll be alone, operating undercover, building a case from the inside." Rita had thought about that, about physical danger versus the danger of silence, about the soldiers whose lives depended on equipment that might be sold to their enemies, about her mother's voice telling her that the world needed people who would stand up for what's right. "I understand, sir. I'm ready." Scott had smiled, the same smile he'd given her 6 years ago in Mozambique when she'd completed an impossible mission, pride mixed with certainty. "Yes, you are. But not really the end. Because for people like Rita Reese, people who wear bracelets woven with black, crimson, and gold, people who can't look away when looking away would be easier, for them, there is no end. Only the next case, the next fight, the next opportunity to prove that integrity isn't optional, that courage isn't convenient, and that one person refusing to be silent can change everything. If this story moved you, if you've ever felt alone in standing up for what's right, if you've ever been punished for being too honest, remember this: you are not alone. There are others like you, like Rita, like Martinez, like Commander Scott. People who believe that principles matter more than convenience, that protecting others is worth personal cost, that the system only works when good people refuse to let it fail. The world needs people who can't look away. People who ask uncomfortable questions. People who build cases when everyone says to let it go. People who stand alone if they must, but who never, ever compromise their integrity for comfort. Be one of them. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of real courage, real integrity, and real people who changed their world by refusing to accept corruption as inevitable. Because these stories aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that doing the right thing still matters, still wins, and still inspires others to do the same. Drop a comment and tell us, have you ever been fired or punished for being too honest? What did you do? How did you find the strength to stand firm? Your story might inspire someone else who's facing that choice right now. Remember, the truth will set you free, but first, it will make you alone. And that's okay. Because eventually, if you stand long enough, others will stand with you. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight.